This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome to a journey into the heart of computer science. Today, we're exploring the fascinating world of hash tables, those lightning-fast data structures that power so much of our digital lives. Specifically, we'll delve into open addressing without reordering, a fundamental challenge where items once placed cannot be moved. For decades, certain performance limits seemed unyielding. But groundbreaking new research has shattered these long-held beliefs, revealing optimal bounds previously thought impossible. Join us as we uncover these remarkable discoveries. Chapter 1. The Unyielding Challenge of Open Addressing. Imagine you have a vast collection of items, and you need to store them in a way that allows you to find any specific item incredibly quickly. This is a fundamental problem in computer science, and one of the most elegant and widely used solutions is something called a hash table. Think of a hash table like a super-organized, lightning-fast filing cabinet. Each item you want to store, let's call it a key, has a unique label. A special function, the hash function, takes this label and points to a specific drawer or slot in the cabinet where that item should ideally be placed. Now, in our filing cabinet analogy, what happens if two different items want to go into the same drawer? This is a collision, and how we resolve it is crucial for the table's efficiency. One common strategy is called open addressing. In an open addressed hash table, if the item's preferred slot is already taken, the system doesn't give up. Instead, it follows a predetermined sequence of alternative slots, checking each one in turn until it finds an empty spot. Once an empty slot is found, the item is placed there. The critical rule for the research we're exploring is that once an item is placed, it stays put. We're operating without reordering, meaning we can't move items around later to make space or optimize their positions. This constraint might seem simple, but it introduces profound challenges. The ultimate goal when designing these hash tables is speed. Specifically, we want to minimize the number of probes, that is, the number of slots we have to check, both when inserting an item and when searching for it later. If an item is placed in the third slot it tried, its probe complexity is 3. When you're dealing with millions or billions of items, every single probe counts. Computer scientists look at probe complexity in two main ways. First, there's the amortized expected probe complexity. This is like looking at the average cost per item over the entire process of filling the hash table. Some insertions might be easy, some might be hard, but what's the overall average? Second, there's worst-case expected probe complexity. This metric is far more demanding. It asks what's the expected number of probes for the single hardest insertion. This usually happens when the table is nearly full, pushing the system to its limits. It's about guaranteeing performance even under the most stressful conditions. Both of these are expected values, meaning we consider the average performance over many different random hash functions. Indeed, the distinction between amortized and worst-case performance has deep roots in hash table research. As early as 1963, computer science pioneer Donald Knuth observed a fascinating disparity in linear probing, another open addressing technique. He noted that while the expected insertion time for a nearly full table could be quite high, scaling as O of delta inverse squared, the amortized expected probe complexity over the entire filling process was significantly better, scaling as O of delta inverse. This early insight highlighted that the average cost over time could be much lower than the cost of the most challenging individual operations, a concept that would become central to understanding hash table efficiency. For decades, the standard classic solution to this open addressing problem has been a technique called uniform probing. In uniform probing, when you want to insert a key, the hash function doesn't just give you one preferred slot. It gives you an entire randomly ordered sequence of all the slots in the table. You then simply try the slots in that sequence one by one until you find the first empty one and place your item there. It's a very straightforward, greedy approach, always taking the first available option. Explain with examples, but do not use analogies that are not truthful. The performance of uniform probing is well understood. For the amortized expected probe complexity, it scales with the logarithm of the inverse of the empty space. Let's make that more accessible. Imagine your hash table has n total slots, and you plan to fill a certain fraction of them. We use a symbol called delta to represent the fraction of slots that will remain empty after all insertions are done. So, if delta is small, say 0.1, meaning 10% empty, the table is 90% full. The inverse of delta, written as delta inverse, would be 10. The amortized expected probe complexity for uniform probing is proportional to the logarithm of that delta inverse. So, if your table gets very full, small delta, the number of probes grows, but only logarithmically, which is quite efficient. However, the worst-case expected probe complexity for uniform probing is much higher. It scales linearly with delta inverse. If delta is 0.1, delta inverse is 10. The worst-case probes would be proportional to 10. If delta shrinks to 0.01, 99% full, delta inverse becomes 100, and the worst-case probes are proportional to 100. As the table gets extremely dense, the cost of finding a spot for those last few items can become very high indeed. For many years, these performance characteristics were believed to be fundamental limits, especially for greedy algorithms. This belief was solidified by a series of significant research findings, tracing back to early work by Donald Knuth. Knuth himself had posed a weaker version of what would become a central conjecture, suggesting that uniform probing was optimal among a restricted class of greedy strategies known as single hashing strategies. This weaker conjecture was subsequently proven by Miklos Ajtai, whose techniques would later form the basis for more general proofs. Building on this lineage, in 1972, a prominent computer scientist, Jeffrey Ullman, put forth a broader conjecture. He proposed that the amortized expected probe complexity of uniform probing, that logarithmic scaling with delta inverse, was actually optimal for any greedy open addressing algorithm. This was a bold claim, suggesting that no matter how cleverly you designed a greedy system that always took the first available slot, you couldn't beat uniform probing's efficiency over the long run. More than a decade later, in 1985, Andrew Yao delivered a celebrated paper titled "Uniform Hashing is Optimal." In this seminal work, drawing upon and extending the techniques developed by Ajtai, Yao provided a rigorous mathematical proof for Ullman's full conjecture. This was a monumental achievement. It essentially drew a line in the sand, establishing that for greedy open-addressed hash tables that do not reorder elements, the performance limit for amortized expected probe complexity was indeed that logarithmic bound. This result became a cornerstone of data structure theory, widely accepted and taught as a fundamental truth. It underscored the unyielding challenge. If even a brilliant mind like Yao proved this limit, what hope was there for significant improvement? Of course, there are ways to achieve better performance in hash tables, but they typically involve relaxing the without reordering constraint. If you allow the system to move elements around after they've been inserted, perhaps shifting an item to a new slot to make way for a new arrival, or to shorten a long probe sequence, then you can dramatically improve efficiency. In this relaxed setting, it's known that you can achieve a constant amortized expected probe complexity, often denoted as O of 1, meaning the average cost per operation doesn't depend on how full the table is at all. This is like a library that periodically reorganizes all its books to ensure optimal access. However, this article, and the research it describes, specifically rejects this relaxation. The core problem remains: can we achieve better performance without ever moving an item once it's placed? This refusal to reorder elements left two critical questions stubbornly open, questions that directly challenged the presumed optimal optimality established by Yao. First, could a non-greedy algorithm, still operating without reordering, achieve an amortized expected probe complexity that was asymptotically better than uniform probing's logarithmic bound? That is, could it achieve something like little o of log delta inverse, meaning it grows significantly slower than the established logarithm? Yao's proof specifically applied to greedy algorithms. What if an algorithm was more strategic, perhaps looking further down a probe sequence before committing to a slot, even if an earlier slot was available? Could this non-greedy behavior break the perceived barrier? Second, and perhaps even more notoriously, could any open-addressed hash table, whether greedy or non-greedy, and, crucially, still without reordering, achieve a worst-case expected probe complexity that was asymptotically better than uniform probing's linear scaling, delta inverse? This was a truly difficult problem. Yao himself, in that same 1985 paper, conjectured that uniform probing was nearly optimal for this worst-case scenario, even for greedy algorithms, suggesting that any greedy scheme would still face a linear dependency on delta inverse. This particular conjecture remained unsettled for decades, a persistent, unyielding challenge that resisted all attempts at resolution. Many researchers tackled it, but the answer remained elusive. These two questions represent the true frontier of open addressing without reordering. They probe the very limits of what's possible when items cannot be moved. For years, the prevailing wisdom, backed by powerful theoretical results, suggested that the answers were likely no, that these bounds were indeed fundamental. But what if those long-held assumptions were, in fact, not entirely correct? What if there were unforeseen pathways to efficiency, hidden just beyond the conventional understanding? Chapter 2. New Bounds, Old Conjecture Broken. In the previous chapter, we laid out the enduring challenges of open addressing without reordering, highlighting two critical unanswered questions and the formidable theoretical barrier erected by Andrew Yao's seminal 1985 proof. For decades, the consensus held that achieving better performance was simply not possible without resorting to the flexibility of reordering elements. But what if that consensus was built on assumptions that didn't fully capture the landscape of possibilities? What if a different approach, a non-greedy strategy, or even a more sophisticated greedy one, could shatter these long-standing beliefs? Enter a groundbreaking piece of research that directly confronts these very questions. It presents not one, but two novel hashing strategies that achieve performance previously thought impossible, effectively disproving the core conjecture left open by Yao for nearly 40 years. This work demonstrates that the perceived limitations were not as ironclad as believed, opening new avenues for efficient data storage and fundamentally altering the theoretical landscape of hash tables. Let's first tackle the broader challenge. Can any open-addressed hash table, even a non-greedy one, achieve superior performance without reordering? The answer, surprisingly, is a resounding yes. The researchers introduced an innovative non-greedy strategy they call elastic hashing. This method fundamentally rethinks how elements are placed, achieving an amortized expected probe complexity of constant time, that coveted O1 performance. This means, on average, the cost of inserting an item doesn't grow, no matter how full your hash table becomes. This is a dramatic improvement over the logarithmic bound previously thought to be the limit for amortized performance without reordering. But elastic hashing doesn't stop there. It also delivers a worst-case expected probe complexity of O log delta inverse. Elastic hashing slashes this down to a logarithmic scale, a significant leap in guaranteeing efficient performance even under peak load.
These two results together directly answer the first two open questions we discussed, demonstrating that it is indeed possible to achieve vastly superior performance without ever moving an element once it's inserted.
Explain with examples, but do not use analogies that are not truthful. How does elastic hashing achieve such remarkable gains? Its design is quite clever, starting by conceptually dividing the entire hash table array into a series of disjoint subarrays. Imagine your big filing cabinet is actually made up of smaller, distinct sections, say A1, A2, and so on, with each subsequent section roughly half the size of the previous one. For any given item, the system simulates a two-dimensional probe sequence, where each probe is tied to a specific subarray and a specific position within that subarray. This two-dimensional sequence is then mapped onto a single linear probe sequence, using a special mathematical function. This strategic, non-greedy decision-making is fundamental to its success, allowing it to sidestep previous theoretical lower bounds. The detailed insertion process and how it manages to achieve these gains will be explored in the next chapter. A critical insight behind elastic hashing is what the researchers call decoupling the insertion probe complexity from the search probe complexity. This allows the algorithm to spread the work of finding empty slots much more evenly across all insertions, avoiding the extreme spikes in cost that plague worst-case scenarios. The full explanation of this decoupling and how it bypasses the bottleneck is detailed in Chapter 3.
The bounds achieved by elastic hashing are not just good, they are proven to be optimal. The O of 1 amortized expected probe complexity is, by definition, the best you can do. And the O of log delta inverse worst-case expected probe complexity is also accompanied by a matching lower bound, meaning no open addressing hash table without reordering can do better. This establishes new fundamental limits for this class of data structures. However, the story doesn't end with non-greedy algorithms. What about Yau's conjecture regarding the optimality of greedy open-addressed hash tables in the worst-case setting? This was the more notorious 40-year-old open problem. This new research delivers another powerful blow to conventional wisdom with a second strategy, a greedy algorithm called funnel hashing, which directly disproves Yau's worst-case conjecture. Funnel hashing achieves a worst-case expected probe complexity of O log squared delta inverse. Let's unpack that. If delta inverse is 10, log squared delta inverse is log 10 times log 10. This grows much slower than delta inverse itself. For example, if delta inverse is 100, funnel hashing achieves something closer to log 100 times log 100, which is roughly 2 times 2 equals 4. Using base 10 for simplicity, though the actual logs are base 2. This is asymptotically smaller than the bound Yau had conjectured, meaning there was still significant room for improvement. This is a profound conceptual shift, demonstrating that even with the strict greedy constraint, there was still significant room for improvement.
Funnel hashing, like elastic hashing, employs a clever hierarchical structure, dividing the main array into a primary section and a special overflow array, with the primary section further subdivided into geometrically decreasing arrays and fixed-sized buckets. This multi-layered greedy approach, which includes a power of two choices mechanism for overflow, allows it to achieve its superior worst-case performance. The detailed mechanics of funnel hashing will also be elaborated upon in Chapter 3. The result of this multi-layered greedy approach is an amortized expected probe complexity that aligns with traditional bounds, but a worst-case expected probe complexity that is significantly better, achieving that O log squared delta inverse. Furthermore, the researchers provide a high probability worst-case bound of O log squared delta inverse plus log n, which means that with very high certainty, no single insertion will exceed this cost. And just like with elastic hashing, these bounds are not merely improvements, they are shown to be optimal, with matching lower bounds proving that no greedy open addressing scheme can do better than O log squared delta inverse in the worst case, and no non-reordering algorithm can beat the high probability worst case bound. The ideas underlying funnel hashing are not entirely new in concept. Similar multi-level hierarchical strategies have appeared in other contexts, such as multi-level adaptive hashing for parallel queries or filter hashing as an alternative to d-ary cuckoo hashing. This suggests that the fundamental principle of organizing probe sequences and storage into layers, especially when combined with powerful techniques like the power of two choices, holds broader utility in optimizing hash table performance. This research demonstrates that these ideas, when applied specifically to the greedy open addressing model, can shatter long-held theoretical barriers. These groundbreaking results redefine our understanding of what's achievable in open-addressed hash tables without reordering. By introducing elastic hashing and funnel hashing, the researchers have not only provided concrete, highly efficient algorithms, but have also fundamentally altered the theoretical landscape, overturning a 40-year-old conjecture and establishing new, tighter bounds for optimal performance. But if these algorithms are so good, how do they manage to avoid the very bottlenecks that plagued earlier approaches? The answer lies in a deeper understanding of how these systems manage collisions and allocate space, which we'll explore next. Chapter 3. Ingenious Pathways Around the Bottleneck. In our journey through the world of hash tables, we've established the formidable challenges of open addressing without reordering, and witnessed how groundbreaking new algorithms, elastic hashing and funnel hashing, have shattered long-held theoretical limits. But how exactly do these ingenious strategies manage to sidestep the very bottlenecks that frustrated decades of research? The answer lies in their clever approach to what computer scientists call the coupon collector bottleneck. Imagine you're collecting a set of unique coupons, say from cereal boxes. Early on, it's easy to find new ones, but as your collection grows, you open more and more boxes only to find duplicates. Finding that very last unique coupon becomes incredibly difficult, requiring many attempts. This is precisely the analogy for uniform probing in a hash table. Each probe for an empty slot is like opening a cereal box. As the hash table fills up, the probability of any given probe hitting an empty slot, a new coupon, decreases. For the very last insertions, when the table is almost full, you might have to make a huge number of probes just to find that one remaining empty space. This phenomenon means that the cost of inserting elements, especially those last few, skyrockets, leading to poor worst-case performance. Uniform probing, by inherently linking insertion cost directly to the number of probes needed to find an empty slot, falls victim to this bottleneck. Elastic hashing, the non-greedy strategy we introduced, tackles this by fundamentally decoupling the insertion probe complexity from the search probe complexity. This is a critical distinction. In uniform probing, these two numbers are always identical. If you check 10 slots to insert an item, you'll check those same 10 slots to find it later. Elastic hashing breaks this unbreakable link. The magic begins with how elastic hashing organizes its probe sequences. Instead of a simple linear sequence, it simulates a two-dimensional probe sequence. Picture your entire hash table array as being subdivided into a series of smaller disjoint arrays, A1, A2, A3, and so on. Each of these subarrays, AI, is roughly half the size of the previous one, specifically designed such that AI plus 1 equals AI divided by 2 plus or minus 1. When a key needs to be inserted, its probe sequence isn't just a list of absolute positions in the main array. Instead, it's a sequence of subarray index position within subarray pairs. For example, a key might first look at the first position in A1, then the second position in A1, then the first position in A2, and so forth. This two-dimensional sequence is then mapped onto a single linear probe sequence using a special mathematical injection function phi ij. This function is designed so that the probe index phi ij has a value bounded by O I asterisk j squared. This means probes in earlier subarrays or earlier positions within any given subarray result in a much smaller search probe complexity value. For instance, if an item is placed in the first slot of A1 corresponding to phi 11, its search probe complexity is very low. If it's placed in the third slot of A2 corresponding to phi 23, its search probe complexity might still be very low, but higher than the first A1 slot. The ingenious part is that the insertion process can explore many potential slots, even those far down the linear probe sequence, but still choose to place the item in a location that corresponds to a short search probe sequence. Explain with examples, but do not use analogies that are not truthful. Consider an example. An item needs to be inserted. Elastic hashing might first try a series of slots in A1. Let's say A1 is nearly full. The algorithm might probe many slots in A1, say 20 or 30 probes, all of which are occupied. This is a high insertion probe complexity for these initial attempts. However, if all these probes in A1 fail, the algorithm might then shift its attention to A2, which is less full. Here, it quickly finds an empty slot, say the second slot of A2. The item is placed there. Its search probe complexity is now determined by the phi 2-2 pair, which, when mapped by the special function, results in a very small number. O2 asterisk 2 squared equals O8, effectively O1. In this scenario, the insertion involved many probes, but the resulting search cost is minimal. This is the elastic behavior. The algorithm probes far down, then snaps back to a strategically chosen low-cost position. This decoupling is the core of bypassing the coupon collector bottleneck for elastic hashing. The algorithm essentially performs a lot of coupon collecting during insertion by checking many slots. But it doesn't penalize the future search time if those slots are far down the list. Most of the coupons collected contribute to finding any empty slot, not necessarily the first available one in a simple linear scan. This allows the system to spread the work of filling up the table much more evenly across all insertions. No single insertion is forced to bear the brunt of finding the very last available slots in a near-full table with exponentially increasing effort. Instead, that effort is distributed, and the search cost remains low.
Explain with examples, but do not use analogies that are not truthful. The algorithm structures insertions into batches, carefully managing the fullness of these subarrays. Batch 0 fills the first subarray, A1, to approximately 75% capacity, seal of 0.75 times A1. Subsequent batches handle insertions into pairs of arrays, AI and AI plus 1. There are three main cases for placing an item, based on the current emptiness of AI, denoted epsilon 1, and AI plus 1, denoted epsilon 2. 1. If AI is less than 1 minus delta over 2 full, and AI plus 1 is less than 75% full, i.e., epsilon 1 greater than delta over 2 and epsilon 2 greater than 0.25, the algorithm tries f of epsilon 1 probes in AI, where f of equals c asterisk min log squared of epsilon caret minus 1, comma, log of delta caret minus 1, for some constant. If it finds a spot, great. If not, it moves to AI plus 1 and places the item there using uniform probing. The number of probes in A_I is carefully chosen to be substantial enough to collect coupons, but not so large as to make the overall insertion too slow. 2. If AI is at least 1 minus delta over 2 full, i.e., epsilon 1 less than equals delta over 2, the algorithm skips trying slots in AI and goes directly to AI plus 1, placing the item there using uniform probing. This ensures that items don't get stuck in a very dense AI if a less dense A_I plus 1 is available. 3. If AI plus 1 is at least 75% full, i.e., epsilon 2 less than equals 0.25, then the item must be placed in AI, using uniform probing. This is considered the expensive case because it's like traditional uniform probing into a dense array. However, the research proves that this expensive case occurs with probability 1 minus O of 1 over A underscore I squared for any given batch. This rarity is crucial, as it ensures that the overall expected costs remain low.
By strategically deciding which array to prioritize based on current load factors, and by allowing many probes during insertion without inflating search complexity, elastic hashing ensures that the amortized expected search probe complexity across all elements remains constant, O of 1. The worst-case expected search probe complexity, even for items inserted into a very full system, is reduced to a logarithmic dependence on the inverse of the empty space, O log delta inverse. This is achieved because the algorithm effectively pushes the harder-to-place items into deeper but still strategically managed subarrays, where their search cost remains bounded. Now let's turn to funnel hashing, the greedy strategy that disproved Yao's conjecture regarding worst-case performance for greedy algorithms. Funnel hashing also bypasses the coupon collector bottleneck, but it does so within the strict confines of being greedy, always taking the first available slot in its probe sequence. Funnel hashing's approach is similarly hierarchical, but distinct. It partitions the main array into a primary section and a special overflow array. The primary section is further divided into many subarrays, A1 through A alpha. These subarrays are geometrically decreasing in size, similar to elastic hashing. Crucially, each of these subarrays is then subdivided into smaller buckets of a fixed size. Specifically, the number of these subarrays, alpha, equals ceil 4 log delta caret minus 1 plus 10, and the size of each bucket, beta, equals ceil 2 log delta caret minus 1. When a key is inserted, funnel hashing generates a probe sequence that's structured by this hierarchy. It performs an attempted insertion into A1. This involves hashing the key to a specific bucket within A1, then checking all slots within that bucket. If an empty slot is found, the key is placed there, and the insertion is complete. This is a greedy action. It takes the first available slot within that bucket. If the entire bucket is full, the attempt fails. Then the algorithm moves to A2, performs an attempted insertion into a randomly chosen bucket there, and so on. This process continues through A3, A4, up to A alpha. If all these attempts fail, the key is finally placed into the special overflow array A underscore alpha plus 1. The genius of this greedy strategy is that each attempted insertion into a bucket effectively collects multiple potential coupons, empty slots, in a single step. Instead of probing one slot at a time and risking a collision, it probes an entire small block of slots. Because each bucket has a size proportional to log delta inverse, each attempted insertion can make a significant, bounded amount of progress in finding a slot. This helps to smooth out the coupon collecting process. The analysis shows that with high probability, each of the primary subarrays, A1 through A alpha, fills up to be almost completely full. This means that keys are generally placed in earlier, smaller subarrays where their probe complexity is lower. The small percentage of keys that fall through all the primary arrays and end up in the overflow array, A alpha plus 1, are handled with another clever trick. This overflow array, A alpha plus 1, is implemented in two parts: a uniform probing section, B, where searches are limited to log n attempts, and a two-choice table section, C, with buckets of size 2 asterisk log n. The uniform probing section, B, maintains a load factor of at most 1/2, ensuring an O1 expected probe count. If an item fails to find a spot in B, which happens with probability at most 1 over log n, it proceeds to C. The two-choice table is a powerful technique where, for each item, two potential buckets are randomly chosen, and the item is placed into the emptier of the two. This power of two choices strategy is incredibly effective at balancing loads. Even with many items, it ensures that no single bucket in the two-choice table becomes excessively full. This means that even items that reach the overflow array are highly likely to find a spot quickly with a low probe count, further mitigating the coupon collector effect.
By layering these strategies, funnel hashing manages to keep the worst-case expected probe complexity at O log squared delta inverse, a substantial improvement over Yao's conjectured linear bound for greedy algorithms. The fact that it can achieve this while strictly adhering to the greedy principle is what makes it so revolutionary. It demonstrates that strategic organization of the search space, even when always taking the first available slot within that structured space, can yield dramatically better results than a simple, unstructured greedy search. The amortized expected probe complexity for funnel hashing remains at the traditional O log delta inverse, but it's the worst-case breakthrough that truly stands out. Both elastic hashing and funnel hashing, through their distinct but equally clever hierarchical organizations and strategic probe management, effectively spread the burden of coupon collecting across many operations and across different layers of the hash table. They avoid the catastrophic buildup of probe costs that characterized previous approaches, especially when the table approached full capacity. This deep understanding of how to manage collisions and empty slots, not by reordering, but by intelligently structuring the probe sequences and the storage itself, is what allowed these researchers to achieve bounds previously thought impossible. While these theoretical breakthroughs redefine the limits of open addressing without reordering, their practical impact may be most significant in scenarios with fixed memory constraints or extremely high load factors. Many common hash table implementations already achieve O1 amortized performance by dynamically resizing at lower load factors and may face different practical bottlenecks like cache locality. For instance, elastic hashing's jumping around across subarrays, while theoretically efficient, could lead to poorer cache performance in real-world systems compared to more localized probing strategies. The question then becomes, if these new methods achieve such impressive theoretical bounds, how do we know these are truly the best possible? Can any other algorithm, no matter how clever, squeeze out even more performance? The next chapter will dive into the rigorous mathematical proofs that establish matching lower bounds, confirming that these newly discovered efficiencies are indeed the optimal limits for open addressing without reordering.
Chapter 4. The Unassailable Limits. Proofs of Optimality. Having explored the innovative strategies of elastic hashing and funnel hashing, this chapter now presents the ironclad proofs that establish matching lower bounds, confirming their optimality and providing a complete picture of these groundbreaking advancements. Let's begin by revisiting funnel hashing, the greedy algorithm that achieved a worst-case expected probe complexity of O log squared delta inverse, directly refuting Andrew Yao's long-standing conjecture, as discussed in Chapter 2. To prove its optimality, we must show that no other greedy open-addressed hash table can do better than omega log squared delta inverse. The path to this lower bound builds upon Yao's earlier work, which proved that the amortized expected time per insertion for any greedy open-addressed hash table must be at least omega log delta inverse. This means, on average, over all insertions, each one costs at least a logarithmic amount. But this doesn't directly tell us about the worst-case single insertion. To bridge this gap, the new research introduces a critical idea. If the average cost is high, then there must be some insertions that are particularly expensive. More precisely, Lemon 9 shows that for any greedy algorithm and for any given load factor, specifically one that leaves a fraction of slots, like 1 divided by 2 to the power of I empty, there exists an insertion whose expected cost is at least proportional to I multiplied by log delta inverse. Think of I here as representing how deep into the filling process you are.
As the table gets progressively fuller, as I increases and the empty fraction shrinks, the cost of some insertion at that stage must necessarily rise. If this weren't true, if all insertions were consistently cheap, then the cumulative sum of their costs would contradict Yaw's original amortized lower bound. This lemma essentially guarantees that the burden of filling a hash table cannot be uniformly distributed. Some operations must encounter significant resistance. Building on this, the proof then focuses on the very last insertion, which is typically the hardest. Imagine the hash table filling up. At various stages, say when it's 50% full, then 75% full, then 87.5% full, and so on, there's a guaranteed hard insertion. Each of these hard insertions contributes to the overall difficulty of the process. The proof uses a technique of strong induction, conceptually compressing the problem. Once a certain number of elements are inserted, the remaining empty slots can be thought of as a smaller, denser hash table. The cost of inserting into this compressed table can then be analyzed recursively. The beauty of this inductive argument is that it reveals the final insertion's cost as an accumulation of these hard stages. The expected time for the final insertion is found to be a sum. C times 1 plus C times 2 plus C times 3, and so on, up to C times log delta inverse. This arithmetic series, 1 plus 2 plus k, sums to approximately k squared divided by 2. In our case, k is log delta inverse. Therefore, the summation leads directly to an omega log squared delta inverse lower bound. This mathematical derivation rigorously confirms that funnel hashing's performance of O of log squared delta inverse for worst-case expected probe complexity in greedy open addressing is not just an improvement, but the absolute best possible. This bound is achieved by funnel hashing, which uses alpha equals O of log delta inverse subarrays and beta equals O of log delta inverse sized buckets, as described in Chapter 3. It's a definitive end to Yaw's conjecture. Next, let's turn our attention to elastic hashing, the non-greedy strategy, which achieved O of 1 amortized expected probe complexity, which is inherently optimal, and O of log delta inverse worst-case expected probe complexity without reordering, as introduced in Chapter 2. The more challenging part is proving the optimality of the O of log delta inverse worst-case expected probe complexity, a lower bound that applies to any open-addressed hash table that does not reorder elements. The proof for this general lower bound is quite intricate, but its core idea can be grasped intuitively. The goal is to show that any such hash table, regardless of its cleverness, must at some point impose a probe complexity of at least omega log delta inverse. The strategy involves assuming, for the sake of contradiction, that all insertions have an expected probe complexity bounded by some constant C. Then it demonstrates that this assumption leads to a logical inconsistency. The proof constructs a sequence of abstract, disjoint sets of slots within the overall hash table. These sets, let's call them Vj, are carefully defined in Theorem 5 and are conceptually similar to the geometrically decreasing subarrays used by elastic hashing. The crucial property of these sets is that their sizes decrease geometrically, specifically by a ratio of 1/8, mirroring the diminishing availability of empty slots as the table fills up. There will be roughly omega log delta inverse such distinct sets. For each of these abstract sets Vj, the proof shows that for any given key, its probe sequence must have a reasonably large probability of hitting a slot within Vj, within its first 2C probes. If this probability were too low, the algorithm wouldn't be able to fill the table effectively. Since there are omega log delta inverse such distinct and disjoint sets, and each has a non-trivial probability of being probed within 2C attempts, it logically follows that the total number of distinct probes expected within those 2C attempts must be at least omega log delta inverse. Since the number of probes is 2c, this directly implies that 2c must be at least omega log delta inverse, and therefore c must be at least omega log delta inverse. This confirms that elastic hashing's worst-case expected probe complexity of O log delta inverse is fundamentally optimal for any non-reordering open-addressed hash table. Finally, we consider the high probability worst-case probe complexity of O log squared delta inverse plus log log n, achieved by funnel hashing, as detailed in Chapter 2. This strong guarantee ensures that with extremely high likelihood, no single insertion will exceed this bound. The proof for this lower bound applies to any open-addressed hash table without reordering.
This proof combines two distinct insights. First, it refines the arguments from the previous lower bound for any non-reordering algorithm by adding the constraint that all keys must have a probe complexity at most C with high probability. This seemingly small addition allows for a much stronger conclusion. Under this condition, it can be shown that for any slot to be successfully filled, it must appear in a key's probe sequence with a probability that scales with log delta inverse divided by the size of the set of empty slots. This extra logarithmic factor, when integrated into the analysis, leads to an omega log squared delta inverse component for the lower bound. Essentially, the requirement for high probability success across all insertions forces the algorithm to explore a proportionally larger part of the hash space, driving up the minimum probe complexity. Second, to account for the log log n term, the proof draws upon a known result from the field of balls and bins problems. Imagine you're throwing a large number of balls into a set of bins. If each ball gets to choose between a limited number of bins, say D bins, and picks the emptiest one, Theorem 8, citing Berthold-Vaching's Theorem 2 from his 2003 JACM paper, states that the fullest bin will still end up with a certain number of balls scaling with omega log log n divided by D. Translating this to hash tables, if we assume that all keys have a probe complexity of at most D, we can map the hash table slots to bins. The proof then deduces that for the hash table to function correctly, this D factor must be at least omega log log n. If D were too small, less than log log n, it would contradict the balls and bins theorem, implying that some bins or hash table locations would become excessively full, which would make insertion impossible or very slow. Therefore, the minimum probe complexity, D, must be at least omega log log n. By combining these two components, the omega log squared delta inverse derived from the density arguments, and the omega log log n from the power of two choices type analysis, we arrive at the full lower bound of omega log squared delta inverse plus log log n. This precisely matches the high probability worst-case performance achieved by funnel hashing, confirming its optimality for this stringent criterion, even though funnel hashing is a greedy algorithm. Explain with examples, but do not use analogies that are not truthful. These matching lower bounds provide the ironclad proof that elastic hashing and funnel hashing push the boundaries of what is theoretically possible under the strict without reordering constraint. The new theoretical limits are now clearly defined, demonstrating that the space for improvement, once thought to be closed by earlier conjectures, was indeed ripe for groundbreaking discovery and opening exciting questions for future innovation. Our journey has revealed that the perceived limits of open addressing without reordering were not as unyielding as once thought. By introducing elastic hashing and funnel hashing, researchers have shattered decades-old conjectures, proving that O of 1 amortized and O of log delta inverse worst-case performance are achievable and optimal for non-greedy strategies, while even greedy algorithms can reach an optimal O of log squared delta inverse worst case.
These breakthroughs, achieved through ingenious hierarchical designs and decoupling probe complexities, redefine the theoretical landscape of data structures. They demonstrate that even in seemingly settled areas of computer science, persistent inquiry can uncover unforeseen pathways to efficiency. As we continue to push the boundaries of data storage, one must wonder, what other fundamental assumptions might yet be ripe for reevaluation? Thank you for listening.